Hey guys, welcome to another episode of crap. Welcome to another episode of VTEC Academy. You're about to get schooled. In the last episode, we left off. We just installed our motor, trying out both sets of mounts so you could see how the K20A2 and the K24 fit inside this car. That is the K24 with an Accord or TSX transmission. Now what I need to do is connect everything. So let's get started. I generally like to start off underneath the car, connect everything up there. Once I get that done, drop it down and start connecting everything from the top. Let's take a look at what we need to do. So the parts I need to install from underneath the car are the header, its heat shield, also the catalytic converter, along with the secondary O2 sensor and the air fuel ratio sensor. I'm going to go ahead and use a transmission brace. If I was using an RSX motor, this transmission brace is actually built into the aluminum oil pan, but I've got a steel oil pan, so I'm going to put this brace on. And then of course the axles. I'll be honest, it would have been a lot easier to put the header on had I done this before. I put the engine in. There's plenty of room without the subframe to lower this in. Unfortunately, I chose not to do that. Anyway, first goes on the metallic head gasket. Next, the header. It's held in by 3 bolts and 2 nuts. As I mentioned before, I'm using RSX Type S exhaust on this car. It's kind of interesting. Take a look up here. Let's see if we can see this. Notice right here, it's got actually like a divided exhaust. So you have the 4 tubes come down into 2 half tubes. And then if we go over here and look at the catalytic converter, again, it's divided in 2 all the way down. So this is a 4-2-1 exhaust. And I'm sure they obviously did that for performance. They're trying to extract 200 horsepower of this. So it's kind of a cool design. If you're using the EP3 exhaust, that exhaust is a little bit different. It doesn't have the division coming into the pipe going into the catalytic converter. It's actually just a single pipe, so it's a little bit, I guess, lower performance. What's also interesting is if you have EP3 header and catalytic converter, it actually bolts up to the stock ES EM2 exhaust. It bolts right up to it like it was meant to be. But if you have the RSX Type 1, that's actually a little bit longer, so you wind up having to have exhaust that's more similar to the RSX. As a matter of fact, if you have a coupe, I believe you might be able to bolt the RSX exhaust directly on. This car originally had RSX exhaust, and all I had to do was I had to lengthen, I believe, the pipe right before it went over top of the axle in order for it to fit properly. Next part is the catalytic converter. If you guys are enjoying the VTEC Academy videos, please consider subscribing. Also hit the like button. That brings us to more viewers so that we can expand our channel, and that'll help us out with bringing you more content. Anyway, don't forget, head on over to the VTECacademy.com store and you can check out shirts just like this one. That also helps support us. we first built this car, we did an RSX race car. When we first built this car, along with the RSX Type S subframe, lower control arms, we also went ahead and swapped in the 5-lug so we could use the much larger outer joint, a lot stronger. So the axles are RSX Type S. Sometimes the axle doesn't want to seat all the way. In that case, I actually like to use the knuckle as a hammer, but it's seated.
Stop! Hammer time! Hammer time!
For the moment, I'm just going to run down the nut, kind of tighten it up. Once I get this thing on the ground and have some help, I'll have somebody put the foot on the brake so I can torque it properly. And don't forget to stake the nut. Staking the nut means putting a dent in the edge so that it coincides with the dent in the outer end of the joint so it doesn't back off. This nut, tightened fully, actually helps hold the bearing together. If this nut were to come off, your bearing could separate along with your wheel. That kind of wraps up everything from the bottom. So now I'm going to drop the car down and go ahead and start attaching everything on top. Obviously the radiator is missing, but before we do that, there's a bunch of stuff that we can get to easily before we put the radiator in. The K24 is super tight against the radiator, so a couple things. Going to want to attach the slave cylinder, clutch slave cylinder, the AC lines, and on top of that, we're going to want to put the radiator in with just a condenser fan on and then slide the radiator fan in afterwards. It's a good idea to disconnect the wiring harness on the front side of the throttle body. That way you can kind of push it down out of the way. It doesn't interfere with the radiator fan as you're sliding it in, but be careful you don't snag it and pull it up because you might dislodge the starter wire, and that's a pain in the butt to put back on once the radiator's in. So be careful and check after the radiator's in to make sure that it's still connected. Real disappointing to get in your car and nothing happens when you turn the key on. As I mentioned earlier, we're using EP3 hoses for our air conditioning. One of the things we had to do in order to get this to work is change where the condenser mounted. Looking down here, you can see that hole to the right side. That is where the condenser used to mount, and the one we welded in further to the left. The condenser sits farther over to the driver's side because that's where the receiver dryer is on this particular swap. So we had to make a couple changes to the mounting points in order to get it where we needed it. There may be a condenser that bolts right in that doesn't have this problem. If somebody knows what it is, put it down in the comment section below and I'll make sure everybody else knows. We had to build this little extension in order to be able to reach our plug. Remember, our plug used to come over on this side over here of the engine initially, so we made that little extension that's going to come across there. Another thing we had to do is we had to swap the radiator condenser fan plugs. We had to lengthen them so that we made sure that the condenser fan was being operated by the condenser fan plug, which would be this one, and the radiator fan was being operated by the radiator fan plug. All right. Just one more bolt to anchor our AC line to the subframe. Where's that hole? There it is. This is our K-Series slave cylinder. It's basically the one off the RSX. It'll work on the Accord just as well. Also, the hard line is from an RSX as well. Now this car was originally an automatic, so I took a pedal assembly from a Civic, placed it in, and I made one custom line that went from the slave cylinder down to the frame rail and then hooked up to the soft line for the RSX. The RSX has a hard line out of the slave cylinder. It comes across the transmission. Then there's a bracket at the back side of the transmission and a soft line that goes to the frame rail. So I just made a short little line that connected from the clutch master to the slave. The radiator we're using is out of a 2002 to 2005 Civic SI, and the reason we use it is because we know those SI hoses would work. That's providing we had an RSX engine in here, which we don't. But the hoses aren't the big deal. But more importantly, there's a piece of plastic trim that goes across the top of the bumper, and there's an opening for the radiator cap that's over on this side. And this lines up perfectly with that. You can actually put the RSX radiator in there. It'll fit fine, but when you put that piece of plastic trim on, the upper outlet is, or sorry, the upper radiator cap is not in the same spot. With the EP3 it is. I'm sure that has to do with the fact that this engine comes in a Civic in Southeast Asia. You may notice my core support is trimmed a little bit here. I'm not sure that's strictly necessary. I think I might have done it originally for a V6 swap I was working on when I was prototyping, but it does actually allow me a little more clearance here. This wiring harness tucks up underneath the core support. We're actually going to zip tie it in place. He's going behind it. There we go. One of the things I did that I thought was kind of interesting is I actually kind of rebent the prop rod. The prop rod typically, looks like I need new plastic over there. The prop rod wasn't quite shaped like this, so I actually reformed it in order for it to work with this. I wonder though if you could get one from an EP3. I'm not really sure if it plugs in the same place. This one I believe plugs in here and here, depending on how high you want to place it. So it's very possible that there's another prop rod that works well, possibly the one from the EP3. I probably should try it out. Well, let me check my starter wire. It's good. shifter cables are, like I said before, they're from the first generation TSX or from the 03 to 07 Accord. They're a little bit different, but this is what's required in order to make the shift properly. They go on just like any of them do. You feed them through the bracket, although they're retained by a couple 10mm bolts, and you put them on the shift mechanism on the transmission. There we go. Next is the heater hoses. If I recall correctly, I used basically a bulk line for this one piece of hose that comes off of the heater valve. For the other one, I think I used one from an EP3, but it's actually just a little bit short. There may be another one that's more effective. I'll have to look and see if maybe the RSX one has a little bit more length and might work slightly better. Next is the purge valve, the brake booster, and the fuel line. They all pass through right here. Here's the stock fuel line. You can see it dead ends right here. This right here is our brake booster line. You can see it kind of pokes up in the air like that. And here is our purge line, comes here and attaches to our purge valve right here. The way the places you're going to attach to, this is our brake booster, so it needs to attach to this. Our purge line is right here. It used to point a different direction. I actually gently massaged the line to get it to bend in the direction I wanted to. Same thing with the fuel line. The fuel line used to not point this direction. I did that, and then using some Dorman products, I manufactured my own fuel line, which will connect straight to the fuel rail. Well, first thing you need to do is get this old set of pipework off so I can show you what I did to modify it. Notice how this line goes up in the air. That doesn't do me any good at all. Here's one I modified. If you look at it, it's pretty much straight. The way I did it was I took a Phillips head screwdriver that was about the same diameter, and I shoved it down in there, and I slowly bent it back straight, putting the Phillips head screwdriver in there a little further each time until I had a straight line. Again, this is a brake booster, so the fact that it's not perfectly smooth doesn't really matter. It works absolutely fine. Put it on. Let's connect all these while I'm here. What was I thinking? What I may have done is actually left the Dorman clip on another fuel rail. I think this is the Honda factory clip, which will work for a Honda factory fitting, but not the Dorman fitting. I'm gonna have to go take a look for it. But we can get the rest of the stuff hooked up. Okay, this actually winds up being a pretty good place for a pause. So let me show you what we've got so far. The fuel line uses a different clip. It reaches no problem up here to our fuel setting, but this clip right here is not the one for the Dorman, it's actually the one for the Honda. I need to get the correct one for the job. Next, if we look back here, the hose, we have, which came off in a cord, that's going to be connecting to our purge line, actually is a little bit large. So I'm going to buy some shrink tubing, some double wall shrink tubing with adhesive. We're going to put that on there so that it seals up nicely. And it's also beer 30. So I'm going to take a little break and go hit Amazon, order a few things, and when it gets in, we'll resume. Thanks for clicking on us. Oh, by the way, there will be, in the show notes, information on the parts I use to make my fuel line. Thanks, guys.